Well, Harvard Law professor Alan Dershowitz is joining us now. He's a new column out today on this very subject. You can find it at Newsmax.com right now. Professor Dershowitz says that President Obama should remember how outraged he was after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke out against the Iran deal. Dershowitz says the president owes an explanation for his hypocrisy and his inconsistency. Alan, it's great to see you again. We'll leave the Obama meddling in the Brexit for there right now because I want to get your take on the presidential candidates in their Israeli policies. Go ahead, Brett.
Yeah, we asked you to grade all of the remaining presidential candidates. After all, you've been a professor here. Let's take a look, starting with the Democrats. Hillary Clinton gets an A-. Not bad.
That's right.
But
That's
wow.
right. The minus is because of some of her advisors, particularly Max Blumenthal, and Max Blumenthal circulating Sidney Blumenthal circulating his son Max's virulently anti-Israel diatribes. And Sidney, who is an advisor to the former First Lady, circulates this to her in her emails, and she ought to stay away from the Blumenthals on Israel. That's the reason for the minus. Otherwise, she'd get an A.
Right. And Bernie Sanders, yeah, quite the opposite. You gave him an F. Why?
And that's with great inflation, because he hasn't done his homework. He hasn't come to class. He doesn't know what he's talking about. When it comes to the Middle East, he is a complete and total ignoramus. He said Israel killed 10,000 civilians. The number was closer to 700. He talked about Israel being disproportionate. He talked about mortality rates in the West Bank, comparing them to Baltimore. He didn't know what he's talking about. Child mortality rates in the West Bank are much lower than in other Arab countries. Just total ignorance and bias. F.
All right, Bernie Sanders, shame on you. He's wearing the dunce cap in Professor Dershowitz's class. All right, let's move on to the Republicans, Professor. Here are the grades. Starting out with Donald Trump, who gets an incomplete. Tell us why.
I just have no way to grade him. He's unpredictable. He says he's the most pro-Israel candidate on the stage, and then he talks about having a balanced approach between terrorist organizations like Hamas and Israel. Impossible to know. He has to complete his homework, and then I'll give him a grade. I suspect he'll get in the BB plus range, but he has to finish his homework first.
All right. Now, if the Trump campaign reached out to you, Professor Dershowitz, and said, will you advise us on Israel, would you accept that challenge?
Sure. I'd accept anybody's offer to advise them on the Middle East or on any other subject I care deeply about in America. We should, as patriotic Americans, offer our advice to any serious presidential candidate, and I've always done that.
All right, and so Ted Cruz gets an A and John Kasich gets an A-. Why does Kasich get an A- and Cruz just gets a straight-up A?
Well, Ted Cruz, I've known for years, and his views on Israel are just down the line, completely pro-Israel. It's hard to see any reason for taking any points off. He's always been an A student, so don't be surprised.
He's the only one in the group who's actually been in your class, so maybe there's a little bias there.
Yeah, maybe just a little.
Professor, I want to welcome in Ann, who's calling us from California. She might take some issue. She is a Bernie Sanders supporter. Go ahead, Ann. You have a question for the professor? You have a comment about Bernie Sanders?
Can you hear us?
Do we have Ann with us?
All right, we'll try to reestablish that connection. Okay. But I am curious because I think a lot of people are unaware when you think of Bernie Sanders. He is Jewish, but he's not practicing. So it's kind of confusing. So a lot of people were kind of confused about it. If you're not familiar with him, I think might be confused by it. Am I right on that?
Doesn't he claim, Professor Dershowitz, that he spent some time in Israel as a child? And is that part of his whole...
He went to a kibbutz when he was a young man. It was a Shomer HaTzair, very, very hard left kibbutz. Non-practicing. Benjamin Netanyahu was a non-practicing Jew as well. You don't have to be a practicing Jew or to be supportive of Israel, or even a Jew to be supportive of Israel. But the idea of creating a moral equality between Israel that has been striving for peace since its establishment and the Palestinians that have been unwilling to recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people and using terrorism for more than 70 years, that moral equivalence is immoral, and he ought to know better, regardless of his religion.
Well, Professor, one more thing we want to talk to you about, since we have you here, is a statement you made, I believe it was to TMZ recently. This is just too good to leave here. You say you could have gotten Jesus Christ off of trial if you were his lawyer. Tell us why.
What a challenge that would have been. Look, Jesus was a great, great person. He was a preacher. He was practicing First Amendment rights, expressing his religious views. He should have been acquitted.
Did they have First Amendment rights under the Roman Empire, or?
Well, no, but the Sanhedrin, remember, it was a multiple trial, and I suspect I could have won the case in front of the Sanhedrin. The Roman courts, I'm not so sure, but would the Romans have overruled the Sanhedrin? I don't know, but he got a bum rap, and imagine the change in history if a Jewish lawyer had managed to acquit one of the greatest preachers and one of the greatest human beings who ever lived, Jesus of Nazareth.
Would you have given Judas the Mark Furman treatment up there on the stand?
Oh boy, would I have loved to cross-examine Judas. Tell me about those 70 silver coins that you got in exchange for this. You're being paid off to turn somebody in. Now, it would have been, there have been many fictional accounts of the trial of Jesus, and I actually conducted such a trial at the Harvard Divinity School against Professor Harvey Cox. We ended up with a hung jury. Many of the Christians on the jury said they had to convict him because if they didn't convict him, there'd be no Christianity. He needed to die. He needed to be crucified to come back to God under the theology. So it's so complicated and so interesting. It would have been one of the great trials in history had he been given an adequate defense. But of course, he was railroaded and not given any kind of a defense.
He probably would have pled guilty, because based on the tradition in the Bible, this was preordained.
But he said to God, Eli, Eli, God, God, why have you abandoned me? So he was making a defense even to God in the face of his imminent crucifixion. So fascinating story. One of the great almost trials of history and one of the most tragic events of history.
This is definitely a talker. And again, you want to check out Alan Dershowitz's article. You'll find it on Newsmax.com. Always a pleasure to have you, Professor.
Great seeing you, Professor.
And we're still wanting to hear from you. We're taking your call, so please give us a call. The number is there on your screen. Again, it's 877-NEWSMAX. Again, that's 639-7629. We'll be right back.